talk about moths. Moths are super interesting and super weird, just like every other animal I've ever talked about on Animal Chat Time. We are going to talk about the difference between a moth and a butterfly, which is quite controversial. And then I'm just going to tell you what moths eat, because this they kind of get a bad reputation, and I just want to set the record clear. So let me also start by saying moths, amazing, beautiful, wonderful creatures. There are 160,000 types of moth. So remember when we did migratory birds and I was like, there are so many of them. How on earth can I tell you about all of them? That's very similar to moths. There are so many moths out there. Most moths are nocturnal, so they sleep during the day, and at night they go off and pollinate and hunt, find friends, hang out, do all their things, get their chores done. Some are crepuscular, which means they come out at twilight. That is an excellent word to use if you are a twilight interested person, or like an owl. Oh, I'm just going to go on my crepuscular walk, but say it correctly and you'll sound a lot cooler. And then there's diurnal species as well, which means that they do all of their stuff during the day and they sleep at night, a lot like most humans. Now, this is a really interesting place to start, because every time you say something about a moth, there's another moth that's like, no, I'm not. So you can say, okay, moths like pollen, and there's a moth in the back going like, I don't. Okay, well, moths also like to chew organic material. We don't like that. So anytime you talk about a moth, there are exceptions and there's different ones and there's diversity, and it's super interesting. So first, we have to know the difference between a moth and a butterfly, because last week, we learned that groundhogs were marmots. And so are moths butterflies? No, they're similar, but again, there's a lot of exceptions. So generally, a really good guiding principle is butterflies have a thin antenna, and they have little balls at the end of their antenna that they use to feel the world, understand different things, lots of stuff. These balls give them lots of information. Moth antennae are normally feathery and they don't have a ball at the end. So the divisions between butterfly and moth, one is called club antenna and one is varied antenna. So a moth has varied antenna. They don't have clubs, they have other things going on. The other differences is sometimes they have a tube-like proboscis. So that's just a real long nose. They have this a really big, long tube nose in the middle of their face, and that allows them to acquire nectar. So butterflies have this. Most butterflies do. Only some moths have it. So already you're like, well, what's the difference between a moth and a butterfly? This thing, but not really. Well, that thing, but also not really. So moth caterpillars spin a cocoon, generally made of silk, and then they metamorphosize into the pupal stage and into flappy, lovely moths that we understand and we're all coloring. Most butterfly caterpillars, on the other hand, have an exposed pupa and it hardens with protein. It's called a chrysalis. And so if you see a cocoon, probably a moth. If you see a chrysalis, probably a butterfly. Probably. Moths evolved long before butterflies, which is super interesting. Butterflies probably evolved from moths, and the fossil record shows us that moths have been on the planet for 90 million years. So they have been around forever. So what are some other things? The coloration of the wings is something that we see, kind of. Most butterflies are butterflies, right? They're colorful, they're big, lovely, but nocturnal moths are normally brown, gray, and black, and they have zigzags and swirls on them. This helps them camouflage during the day. So they look kind of like bark or leaves or wherever they sleep during the day so predators don't eat them. However, there are day moths that are brightly colored. Generally, they're toxic, so that's kind of interesting. And the diurnal species, the ones that are awake and doing stuff during the day, they evolve to locate their mates generally through seeing each other, which is why they have so many different colors. The ones at night find each other through pheromones. And so at night, you can't really see them because it's nighttime. So they ooze delicious smelling hormones to each other, saying like, hey, do you want to be my pal? Okay, let's be pals. During the day, they're like, I will show you how pretty my wings are. And that's when we should be pals. Sure. So the structure of the body also shows a difference between most moths and butterflies. Moths tend to be stout, furry, hairy-looking bodies. Butterflies are slender. They normally have smoother abdomens. Moths have larger scales on their wings that make them look more dense and kind of poofy. Butterflies have scales, but they're very, very, very fine. Now this difference, we don't actually know, which I love learning about things like this, when we know something about a species, but we don't know why it's like that. We think that moths are poofy, so they can absorb heat during the day, and on cooler nights when they're flying around, they don't get so cold and they don't have to use so much energy. Also, bats are poofy because if you are poofy, then you can absorb and you can confound the echolocation of bats, which is super interesting. So at night, they're flying around. They don't want to get eaten by bats. And so their poofiness, remember that bats talk to each other and they hunt by going click, 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 click. And the clicking through the air hits something and it comes back and they're like, there's something flying around that's delicious, or there's a wall, or there's a human hair, there's something in front of me. But if something is super poofy, then it absorbs the clicking and the bat doesn't see with its clicking, with its hearing, it doesn't see that there's moths around. So that is pretty neat. The time of day also distinguishes between a butterfly and a moth. Again, most moths, nighttime, kind of changes. Resting posture also is something that changes, which is super neat. So moths normally rest with their wings spread out. So everything that you're coloring right now is probably a moth with its wings spread out. This is how they rest. And this is normally because they are trying to blend in with bark or with leaves or sediment or things like that. And also they're trying to absorb sunlight. Butterflies will fold their wings on their back. Sometimes they will bask in the sun, but most of them rest this way when moths. Oh, Daniel, that's excellent. See, that is a moth resting, just having a little resting time with its wings flat out. Most moths, some moths will also, instead of resting flat out, will put their wings on top of each other. So sometimes there's not enough room for them to fully spread out their wings, and so they give their wings kind of a hug. Okay, so let's just talk about moths. Now we know the difference between a moth and a butterfly, and we know that there's not really a binary. There's kind of exceptions for everything. Moths are nocturnal, mostly, insectivores that eat, so they're insectivores, they eat insects. But they are eaten by a lot of different things. Everyone always wants to know what predates these animals. So they're eaten by some bats, owls, birds, lizards, amphibians, cats, dogs, rodents. Some bears will eat moths when they're really big, because why not? Moth larvae are also vulnerable to being parasited by wasps. And so sometimes what will happen is there will be a caterpillar of a moth and a wasp will lay eggs on top of it. The eggs will hatch and they will then eat the caterpillar. They will use it to grow big and strong. Which, nature is wild, y'all. That is definitely the thing of nightmares if you're a caterpillar. Now, there's also something we don't 100% know, but we kind of know, that there's evidence in the ultrasound that, oh, that's a happy one. Good one, Daniel. He has very big antenna. So this one is super neat. So there's evidence that in ultrasound, the range emitted by bats causes moths to make evasive maneuvers. So what on earth does that mean? What it means is the moths can actually feel the click, 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 click that the bats are putting into the air so they can hunt these moths, and they feel it and they move around. So they feel that they were hit by a sound wave from a bat, and they go like, oh, no, thank you. Tiger moths especially, we've seen this happen, that, oh no, sorry, I'm lying. I'll come back to tiger moths. There are many moths that will drop a few centimeters or inches so they can evade attack, but tiger moths are interesting because they can emit their own clicks. And so a bat is clicking and saying like, is there any food out there? And a tiger moth will be like, there's no food over here, I'm just a bat. And the bat will fly away, which is so neat. Oh my gosh, evolution. There's tons of ecological importance. Of course, if there is 160,000 different types of this animal, they must exist for like many different important reasons. They are key pollinators of flowering plants. Even if the moth doesn't have a big proboscis and it doesn't hang out on flowers, they still are so poofy that if they land on a flower or land on something that has pollen, it will move pollen everywhere. So moths are also attracted to light, and we see this all the time. This is something that like oftentimes you see, wow, that is so pretty. That looks like an atlas moth that we are going to look at later. So, you know, there's a phrase like a moth attracted to a flame or a light or things like that. We don't actually know why they do this. We have an idea, and we think that that moths are attracted to artificial light is because they use something called celestial orientation. And so they're able to see light in the sky from stars when it's nighttime, obviously, but the celestial objects are so far away that if you were to go closer or far away from it, then you know it would get not as bright. And so after traveling such great distances, when you are a moth, if you what am I trying to say? When you're navigating, if something is so bright, you go into it because you think maybe this won't change or this will change, and I'm not really sure where it is. And they get disoriented because their horizon suddenly changes. And so that is really interesting when we think about light pollution. And we have definitely seen, hi friends, hi Leaf, hi Tula. We're just talking about moths and why they are attracted to light. So we don't actually know. We do know that they use celestial orientation. So they use the lights in the sky, lights from planets and stars to navigate, but we don't know why they fly so close to light. We think what happens is they think the light is super far away and they fly around it to navigate, and then they are so, it's so bright, they're just disoriented and they don't really know what to do. So what do moths eat? And I thought this would be something to like really dive into because they have such a bad reputation and people do not like moths. So in their primal phase, when they are caterpillars, moths possess chewing organs that they chew just about anything. They chew, oh yeah, like that little caterpillar friend. They chew hair, fur, furniture, dust, paper, oil, wood, clothes, wool, anything like that. So like we said before, apart from like the splendor that is a butterfly, there are many moths. There's 160,000 types of moths. So there's tons of splendor out there for all of them. The main differences are the type of antenna. So the butterflies have like a ball at the end of their antenna, and generally moths have like furry antenna. And of course, moths generally, oh, good work, Daniel. So generally, moths have scalier wings and they're poofier. The other kind of difference, because most moths are nocturnal, they don't really use their eyesight at all. They use it for navigation, for the celestial fields, for light, but when they are hunting or looking for food, they don't really use their eyesight for food. They see like, I want to go in this direction, and then they start smelling and they start seeing the world around them through their noses, through their little fingertips. They don't really have fingertips, through their feet, we'll say. And they have an excellent sense of smell, and that enables them to bloom on flowers at nighttime, which is pretty neat. Now, moths have this very bad reputation for ripping holes in sweaters, in our couches. They hang out everywhere. And if you see an adult moth on a sweater, maybe you won't, but historically people are like, no, you're eating a hole in my sweater. This is unfortunately not true. These adult moths do not care about your sweater. They would like to go have pollen. They want to go hang out on flowers and in trees and things like that. The adult moths are just resting. The things that are eating all of your clothes are actually the larvae, the caterpillars. Some adult moths actually don't even have mouths. What? Sort of like fireflies. Some don't have mouths at all. Some don't have teeth. They have like a mouth that they can like chat with their friends. But there's no nums. So what do larvae eat then? And why would only larvae eat? Well, the larva, so a mom moth will lay between 5 and 50 eggs. Again, there are so many different types of moths. There's a lot going on. But she lays the eggs. When the eggs hatch, they generally eat their own shell, their own egg. So they get a sudden burst of calories, and then they eat anything that's around them. So depending on the type of moth, sometimes it will be plant leaves, cherry trees. A common oak moth only eats oak. A cherry dagger moth only eats cherry trees. They are highly what is the word I'm looking for? Who knows? Evolution has made sure that a cherry moth eats a cherry. This moth eats a that. That moth eats a this. But all of them are voracious eaters. All of them are very hungry caterpillars when they start. They have a long way to go. Some moth caterpillars will eat so much that their skin can't grow that fast. And so they'll shed their skin molting a few times when they're growing, because they're eating so much. Some larvae will eat just plants. Some will also have nectar, but because they're so hungry, and they will chew just about anything. So there are quite a few moths that as soon as the babies are born, they will chew on your furniture, like not your hair because you're around, but like hair that's on the floor or like maybe in between cushions. I know my hair does that. Anything that's near oil or wool or things like that. They're pretty gluttonous eaters. So like anything that is organic, they num. Excuse me. So the adult female moths of the caterpillars that like to eat fibers don't eat cloth at all. They what they do is they lay their eggs that have a very special type of glue on them, and they hang out on cloth. They're so small they cannot be seen by the human eye, and it makes it impossible to sort of like detect a caterpillar infestation until there's a lot of holes and things. But it's not the moms or the dads that are doing it. It is the babies going like, I'm so hungry, I need to have more. And they'll eat anything as long as it's organic. And even at that time, something just seems like it's fibery, it will be delicious. And they do this because they have to create their cocoon. So remember, generally, butterflies have chrysalises that are hard, but moths will make cocoons out of silk. So they make a cocoon because it's more camouflage. So they don't want to get eaten by a predator when they're a baby, when they're an egg, or when they're in the metamorphosis stage, right? So they have something that looks like the natural world that is, you know, it could be moss, it could be a leaf, it could be all these other things, but that calorically takes a lot, right? So that is why they eat so much, because they're going to have to make this whole cocoon around them. They don't eat when they're in the cocoon because they are metamorphosing. But then, like, what do adult moths eat? So like I said, some adult moths don't even have mouths. The point of an adult moth is just to like find a mate, make some eggs, and, you know, have a grand time. Some do have those giant proboscises. It is a proboscis. I actually don't know what the plural is. And that is a big old tube coming out of their nose that they can drink the nectar of a flower. And so those ones are really important for pollination. Yep, sure, we'll go with it. Adult moths need this nectar to like to power their wings so they can fly around. But they also, if it is a moth that does eat as an adult, they will suck on honeydew, juices, decaying fruit, tree sap, manure liquids, and droppings. Yes, some of them do eat poo. And we're always interested in learning if animals eat poo. Some moths will. But yeah, interestingly, some adult moths don't eat anything at all. They just rely on the energy that they had when they were caterpillars, and they fly around and meet each other for reproduction, and that's the only thing they need to do as adults. So that's kind of interesting. Now, we always want to know how big and how small moths get. I'm going to show you some pictures in a second, but the largest moth in the world, whoa, that is a great looking moth. And see, its antennae are super furry. So you know it's a moth, probably, there's so many exceptions, but you know it's a moth because its antennae are furry and they don't have little bulbs at the end. So the largest moth in the world is an Atlas moth. They call it a gentle giant because they are very hungry caterpillars, but they don't actually, wow, so many colors. Whoa, from Tula and from Field, excellent colors. Now, the Atlas moth is one of actually the biggest insects in the planet. It has a wingspan that is 27 centimeters. So if you look at a ruler, rulers are generally 30 centimeters. So it's almost as long as a ruler, which is lovely. But what is the smallest moth, you ask? I'm happy that you did. It is the Stigmella maya. It's found in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it's 1.2 millimeters. So I have a ruler here. This is like the biggest moth. Whoa, that just hit me in the face. The biggest moth is this big, and the smallest moth is, wait, is that big. What? That's small. So little. And so again, there's 160,000 moths in the whole world. Each one of them is such an individual. They are big and small and eat sometimes a lot, sometimes not anything at all. So I'm trying to get away from the sun so you can see my lovely face. But why don't we take a look at some moths, because they are so cute. I can't even with them. Let's start from the beginning. Everyone, if you are not paying attention to this, there it is. Now everyone has seen it. This is a poodle moth. It is amazing. It's my new best friend. His name is George. He's wonderful. So on this moth, you can see they're very furry. They're very dense. Their antennae have like little scale guys. They're not long. And you can see it's just furry everywhere. This is a nocturnal moth, and you can tell that because it is so furry and because its eyes are nocturnal eyes. And this moth specifically is so furry for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is to try to evade bat echolocation. So they absorb the clicks and the yelling that bats are doing in maybe no, okay, bats are doing, so they can't get eaten or won't get eaten. This is an atlas moth, so this looks very similar to what Birch was drawing earlier, or coloring. This is about 30 centimeters across, and so they're really big. You can tell that they're either crepuscular or they're diurnal moths, because they are so colorful. So they have to show off to their friends to get a date, essentially. This is a leopard moth. It is also, all of them are so beautiful, but you can see that its antennas don't have a bulb at the end, but they are quite long. And it is trying to blend in with the rocks and the trees around it. All of these dots are so when it's sleeping during the day, it doesn't get eaten by anything. Here's another moth, and this one has its proboscis out. So this is a moth that is super important for pollination. It's a pollinator, and it pollinates with its whole body. It's so furry that it collects pollen from everywhere, and that pollen goes from one plant to another plant to another plant. And this proboscis, this nose, is like a giant straw. So it puts it inside the plant and it sucks out the nectar, and that is how it eats as an adult. And here's just like another lovely moth. It's so pretty. You can see from its antenna that it is a moth. It has very translucent, lovely wings, but it is still quite furry. They're quite stout. They're sort of like the corgis of the butterfly moth family. They're so nice. And that is moths, my dear friends. Have I ever used Zoom? I have. So, who has questions about moths that I can maybe answer? Birch, you do.
But I also want to tell you that I've been stung by a moth caterpillar.
What? Oh
there are moth caterpillars that they're called, I think, tussock moth. Spotted tussock moth caterpillar.
Whoa.
They're black and yellow, or red and black, or they're just these fuzzy little caterpillars, and they really hurt if you touch them.
Right. Okay. Well, I guess do not. Well, that is probably so they don't get eaten by predators. They're those colors. So when birds or other things want to eat them, the birds will look at them and go like, oh, wait, you will hurt. I don't want that in my mouth. Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that you were stung, but like, I'm happy that you lived, but kind of interesting that you had a close encounter of the moth caterpillar kind.
My question was that how big are their feet?
Big are their feet? Well, it depends on the type of caterpillar and moth. So they don't have like toes like we do. They sort of like taper down. They are able to like grab on to bark and trees and things like that. So they don't have big feet like we'd see like a gecko that has like a big pad or anything like that. But sort of like other insects like ants, they have like little grabbies that they can hang on to stuff.
Like, what kind of habitat do they have to live in?
It's a good question because I didn't really get into it because there are so many different moths, right? So moths live everywhere in the world, including Antarctica, but not naturally. They live in Antarctica because they live with people that come down to Antarctica. They live in their clothes and things like that. So their eggs are so small, people can't see that that they have moth eggs on them. And so sometimes there are moth outbreaks in places in the high Arctic and in Antarctica because people just show up. They have all their wools and their knits and their everything, and then all of a sudden there's holes and they're like, there were caterpillars here eating things. But And caterpillars do live outside. They like to live, so the nocturnal ones live like on trees, on rocks, on plants and things like that. They don't live in like the cold. They will hibernate. There are some moths that will dig a hole, and instead of having like a cocoon like we see some moths, they'll do their pupal stage in a hole, and it will take a couple of years, sort of like a cicada. And so they do live all around the world, in foresty areas, in plains, kind of everywhere. And so they are, because there's 160,000 different types, they can be everywhere because they are so evolutionarily designed for the exact place they live.
I was wondering, what is the brightest type of moth?
The brightest type of moth? That is a great question. I don't actually know the answer to it. So it would be a moth that is a diurnal species, and so it lives during, or it is active during the day. It would be a moth that feeds on flowers that are active during the day as well. So it's probably a moth that lives in South America or in Southeast Asia, definitely there, but I don't actually know. That's a great question. I can look that up for you, and we can talk about that next animal chat time, because that is a cool question. Bright moth. I'm just going to write on a paper, and we'll see if I remember what that is about later. Oh, we have a question in the chat that how long do they live? Oh, also, thank you. I thought that my earrings kind of like looked like diurnal moths. So how long do they live? That's a great question. There are some moths that only live for a couple weeks, and there's some moths that live for a couple years. None of them live like decades and decades, but it really depends if it is a moth that eats. So the ones that don't have mouths when they're adults they do not live as long as other ones. But if it is a moth that is in the pupal stage or a caterpillar for a few years, they can live quite a long time. So the ones that generally eat are clothes and wool and things like that. They're on like kind of like a 30-day cycle, but other ones that live in like the rainforest can last a lot longer. But then there's ones that kind of like hibernate and go into torpor when they are little egglets, and they also live a long time. So huge variety, huge spectrum of moths. So I'm like trying to get out of the sun so I don't look like the Phantom of the Opera, but I'm just gonna have to live with it. So let's do 3 more questions. Let's do Daniel, because you've had your hand up for a while.
How do you want to get a ball in tunnels dig? Like, how do months dig the tunnel?
Oh, how do they dig a tunnel? Yes. So what they normally do is they take over tunnels from other animals. And so if they live in the bark of a tree, sometimes like the barks of trees, there's like little holes and stuff like that from the tree growing, for the natural process. Sometimes they get waterlogged and expand, and there's cracks in trees. So they can go into there. They don't dig their own holes. Generally, it's the same with the holes in the dirt. Something has already dug a hole. They can kind of like maneuver around a little bit with their face, but it's like pre-existing holes in the ground.
I have 2 questions. The first one is my Fields question, but he doesn't want to ask. But he wants to know, what is your favorite features of a moth?
Oh, my favorite feature, well, I would have to go back to the poodle moth that I showed you. And I just love when they are so poofy, when they have like a poofy little face and like poofy little feet and poofy little antenna. I just think that is so cute. And I think like sleek butterflies are really nice, but I am all for poofy all the time.
I was also wondering, what is the moth dance?
Oh, okay. The moth dance is very good. It's very similar to other dances that we've seen, but so it's flying, but then it's resting, and then it's resting. So there's 3 things. We got to fly, we got to rest, and then we rest like a gentleman or lady or non-binary poodle moth. So we fly, rest, and rest. Fly, rest, and rest. Yeah. The choreography, I think, oh, I already messed it up. But we can do that all day, and it would like keep us warm, it will cool us down. It also like, I think it's a like really mindful dance that we can do. So Leaf and Tula, I think you both have the last questions of the day. Daniel, that is awesome globes that you have made. Those are cool.
I was wondering how small are moth eggs?
Yeah, that is a great question because they are so small. So Atlas moth eggs are pretty small. They are, they're like the tip of this pen. So you can see them, you can see the tip of it. And that's the biggest moth in the world. That grows up to be 30 centimeters across. That's a whole ruler. But then all the other moth eggs are so small, you actually can't see them. You have to use a microscope because they start off so itty bitty little. And that is why when they're growing as caterpillars, they molt because they start off so little. And the reason they're so little is they don't get predated. They don't get eaten by other insects or animals. Insects, animals, etc. So they're really small, so they don't get gobbled up, which is super interesting. Excellent. Well, I am delighted that we could talk about moths. They are so neat and something I didn't know anything about. And I will admit, when I saw moths on my clothes before, I was like, oh man, this moth is eating stuff. No, it's not. Its babies were. It was fine. So thank you everyone for doing the moth dance with me. Extend, come in even more.